Welcome to AP Biology and the end of chapter 25. As I mentioned, your test over Unit 7 is a week from tomorrow. That's Wednesday, March 31st, the last day we meet before spring break. That test will be over chapters 22 through 26. And we're finishing 25 today, which means next class we're going to look at a very fundamental look at chapter 26. I'm just going to point out some major concepts that you want to take away from that chapter, and a lot of it we're going to kind of just chop off and not worry about for the test because we're running out of time. After today's lecture, we're going to look at some AP classroom problems. So that's all we have for today. This is also your reading for today into next class. So hopefully you learn a lot. The end of chapter 25 looks at kind of major global events and genetic kind of phenomena that affect both speciation and extinction rates. So at different times in Earth's history, we have seen, some to many species disappear very quickly, others appear at a very fast rate. So that's what we're going to look at today. The diagram I have here is a generalized look at both speciation, where you get splits. This would be a common population that diverges, is isolated into two or more groups, and take different evolutionary paths. That is speciation. Extinction is noted by what? The little dagger here shows a pathway that no longer lives on Earth, and we indicate that as the symbol for extinction. Extinction means the entire species is gone. This is something that happens a lot. I don't think your book mentions it, but it seems like most species are on Earth for about 2 million years on average. Some are here for way longer, some less time than that, but 2 million years seems to be kind of the classic time frame for the amount of time a specific species is on the planet before it goes extinct. Now, just because it goes extinct doesn't mean other branches don't keep going, and that's kind of the nature of evolution. You're trying many different paths. Some continue on, some stop. That's speciation versus extinction. Now, in terms of major global influences that we think have had effects on speciation and on extinction are tectonic plates and continental drift. The whole crust of the Earth is divided into these various plates that have all been kind of mapped out and named over the last 100 years or so. And they are essentially floating on kind of the liquid innards of the planet. So these plates are grinding on top of, underneath, and kind of side to side against other plates, and they are changing their position around the world. The red dots indicate kind of volcanic and earthquake locations, and you see that they tend to be centered where? Near boundaries, along the cracks, that's right. There's even what's called the Pacific Ring of Fire, which is this enormous Pacific plate that borders a number of other plates, and there is a lot of volcanic and seismic activity along those. Now, what this tells us, if we kind of rewind the clock of Earth's history, is that over vast periods of time, the Earth can look very, very different. So if we look at present day, this is the world map that we are all familiar with, but we can go way back, and based on geologic records, we can, and kind of magnetic particles, how they're aligned in the rock, we can figure out where the land was positioned in previous ages. So here we have three major eras, the Paleozoic, Mesozoic, and Cenozoic eras, with a general look at what the Earth, all the land masses of the Earth looked like at those times. So in the beginning of the age of dinosaurs, we actually have all the land masses stuck together as one large landmass called Pangaea. Now, what that means is that when dinosaurs first appear in the fossil record, and by the way, during this time, mammals, the first mammals show up as well, there are fewer geological or geographical barriers separating populations. So a lot of the life forms that speciate at the beginning of the Mesozoic, so your first mammals, your first dinosaurs, they are on a planet where they can basically radiate out, spread out through all the land masses of the world. Now, Pangaea, over the course of hundreds of millions of years, breaks up into eventually the current world map that we see today. Now, that breakup means populations become isolated. And there's a lot that understanding continental drift allows us to do. It allows us to understand, why is it that the world's primates are found in South America and Africa and into Asia? And why are the primates in South America and Africa different from one another? Well, they were once connected together and only somewhat recently have separated. And once the primates of South America and of Africa separated, they went on different evolutionary journeys because their environments were different and they weren't allowed to, interbreed because the Atlantic Ocean was between them. So you start to understand why you have certain life forms in certain places once you understand what the world looked like at one time. Now, this is definitely going to have an effect on how new species arise, but it can also have an effect on extinction. I mean, there was a time where Antarctica, which we refer to as basically the South Pole, had tropical plants. Well, there are species of tropical plant that probably once were on this Antarctica landmass that went extinct because it's now at a part of the world that gets very little sunlight and is frigid and cold. So based on how land masses have moved, we can start getting a picture of how different populations speciate into new species and why some species just aren't around anymore. On the topic of mass extinction, there have been 5 mass extinctions. 5 extinction events that have happened, that we have identified in the fossil record, that have been much more prominent than any other period where extinction rates may have increased. You can see them with the red spikes here. Those are your 5 mass extinction events. Down here, you have the eras listed out, and those eras are broken into periods given just 1 or 2 letter symbols. So it's things like Triassic, Jurassic, Cretaceous during the time of the dinosaurs. Notice extinction rates go up and down as you move through time, but what life looks like on Earth today is very much affected by when these different mass extinctions happen. And we're going to take a look at that. Now, if you notice, the Paleozoic to Mesozoic, that break exists because in the fossil record, we see the worst mass extinction that we are aware of. This is what we call the end Permian extinction that basically almost wiped out life on Earth and led to what we call the Mesozoic era. We don't know the cause of it, but there's geological evidence that indicates basically all of Siberia was molten rock at this time, which tends to indicate a lot of volcanic activity, which can drastically change the climate and the atmosphere. So some sort of global event or event that affected the entire globe caused somewhere, a very high mass extinction rate. Now, life recovers afterwards, which is the blue line. The blue line kind of shows global diversity. So you can see a drop off after the mass extinction and a recovery period, which is pretty typical for mass extinctions. Now, what you may not be aware of is that due to this mass extinction, the planet was kind of an open world for the survivors. I mean, this goes back to kind of the idea of like bottlenecking and the founder effect. Once you have life survive whatever this event was, then it is capable of bouncing back, but it bounces back in an interesting way. The survivors of a major mass extinction, like I said, have a whole world in front of them. So what ends up happening is natural selection kind of becomes a little less strict. With an open world, all sorts of different forms can kind of arise through random mutation, and they're not immediately beaten down because of competition, because almost everyone's dead and the world is open for you. So what you find at the end of the Permian is so many environments are left kind of open for the taking that evolution experiences what we call adaptive radiation. Life forms radiate out in all kinds of different directions. You start getting, in this early time period, you start seeing like lizards with beaks and all sorts of strange things. Some of those strange things were furry small reptilian creatures, the first mammals. Some of them were the first dinosaurs. So the mass extinction of the ENS 1 era can start, new life forms showing up in the fossil record for the next era. Now, even though mammals were around, the environment, the global environment, very much favored the dinosaurs during this time. There are small spikes in the extinction rate, but nothing like what you then have about 65 million years ago. We have a lot of evidence that a 6-mile wide asteroid hit kind of in the Gulf of Mexico, probably caused so much debris to be cast in the air that you had a winter that may have lasted for about 3 years. And all the large animals seem to have suffered and gone extinct as a result. And it's really what ends the dinosaurs and then we find kind of opens up the door for mammals. This is another diagram from your book that kind of shows kind of higher periods of extinction with the mass extinctions in red dots. There does seem to be an indication that warmer planetary global temperatures are a little bit more favorable for mass extinctions than cooler ones, which is somewhat fascinating because we are experiencing a slight increase in global temperatures right now, and we're seeing evidence of mass extinctions, like 1/3 of bird populations disappearing in the last 50 years. So global temperatures seem to play some role in these mass extinction events. Now, I already mentioned this, but it's not all bad news. Mass extinction is a horrendous, catastrophic event for a planet and the life on it. It usually takes millions of years, maybe tens of millions of years, for the planet to bounce back and to see the diversity return that it lost. But the good news is this adaptive radiation that I described. Even though a mass extinction seems bad, it does allow a bit of a reset. And certain species that may have never been allowed to compete because of slight differences in their fitness, they are allowed to expand around the world. And we find that's what happened to mammals, and that's why we are probably even here. So, at the end Permian extinction, experiments that are allowed to happen because the earth is kind of open and there for the taking seem to have allowed for the initial appearance of mammals. We basically scurried in the shadows, way smaller than the dinosaurs, probably unable to really compete with them. And then, about right here, is when the dinosaurs go extinct. And without the dinosaurs dominating certain niches of the environment, after they are gone, we see a really big expansion of what we call placental mammals, which are basically mammals with a uterus that nurtures the unborn child until birth. Marsupials experience a somewhat similar increase in diversity, but the monotremes do not. Those are your egg-laying mammals, the weirdos of the mammal world. So this is what we call adaptive radiation. A mass extinction hits, it opens up a kind of unoccupied world, and the survivors are able to radiate out into all sorts of different forms. And we are now in the Cenozoic era, which is essentially the age of mammals. Now, it's not all about just global changes and mass extinctions. The chapter continues on to talk about genetic components that help drive major changes in populations that can lead to speciation. Now, there is a lot of text on this slide, but this is the term that I want you to maybe make note of out of all the words on here. I'm not sure if this is pronounced heterochrony or heterochrony. Heterochrony probably sounds like the right pronunciation. It's kind of like thermometer versus thermometer. I guess you could say it either way. There are genes that control kind of the timing of the development of the individual. And it's genes that can have major influences like this that can allow for what we call speciation events. One place we think these kind of developmental genes come into play, one example, is the difference between humans and chimpanzees. Our two populations seem to have diverged somewhere about 8 to 10 million years ago. There was some common ancestor that we probably both branched off from over that time. But what we find is that in terms of the fetus and even the kind of infancy of humans versus chimps, chimps have a faster developmental period. If you made a 1-year-old chimp and a 1-year-old human compete, the chimp is going to win. All right? And a lot of that has to do with kind of the timing of developmental events controlled by genetics. Now, where we have a pretty clear advantage is that while our development starts out slow, we play kind of a longer game and end up having a much more developed brain later in life. So as an adult, our development has continued for much longer, and we have many capabilities that chimpanzees do not. A lot of this is about genes that control the timing of our development. Those genes have been changed in different ways in our two populations. We see the results and the kind of subsequent fitness that we have compared to chimpanzees. And by the way, I don't want anybody to get the idea that like we're better than the chimps. Do not get in a fight with an adult chimp. As a human, you are the weakest, frailest primate on the planet. For our size, we should be way stronger, and a chimp will defeat you in combat if it's just hand to hand. But where's our advantage? Guns, yeah, which we develop through our brains and imagination. We can actually wield weapons, communicate to each other in groups much more effectively than they can. And so, a lot of that is based on kind of our developmental trajectory outpacing theirs after a while. There are other examples of how genes can kind of create major changes that delineate one line of a population from another. There are these homeotic genes that are discussed in your book that essentially control kind of major general body plans. And they give the example of this HUX gene that is found in a lot of invertebrates. And these genes seem to have a large influence on like how many legs these invertebrates have. And so you can find that in distantly related individuals, it's this gene that is actually controlling a pretty major phenotypic characteristic between these two, which is how many legs you have. So there are genes out there that can control some pretty major body development structures. If you get mutations in them, different varieties of these genes, it can lead to pretty significant differences in body form, which is clearly important when it comes to surviving in the environment. So genetics plays a huge role. Certain genes can play a much bigger role than others when it comes to populations changing over time. And then the last thing I want to look at here at the end of the chapter is the name of this section and then one diagram from the section. There is no plan. Evolution does not have a target. It is primarily driven by random changes in genes, driven by mutations. It's driven by what the environment is like today. And it's also influenced by things like genetic drift, just random fluctuations, random catastrophes. So if you look at the history of life on Earth, it does not appear as if from single-cell prokaryotes we were on a straight shot to humanity. It appears that humans are a current, surviving, or extant branch of the tree of life. And as an example of how not goal-oriented evolution is, your book goes through kind of the family tree and the evolutionary path of horses over the last 50 or 60 million years. There are many, many, many different lines and forms of horse that arose and because of environmental changes or natural catastrophes just died out. So it's not that you go from one small horse population in a straight line to the modern, larger hoofed horse. All right, there are many different experimental forms that we find branching out over time, probably based on genetic changes and just based on which path was most fit for the environment at that time. And where this meandering has ended us up at is the modern horse. So evolution is not a straight line. It is a branching tree, and some of the branches are still alive today. Once a branch goes extinct, it's done. That gene pool and that genetic diversity is gone. But as long as a branch can continue, that general line continues. It is possible that the environment of the earth can change so much that all the branches stop. And then you have a planet that has no life on it. There are things that will cause major changes over the next few billion years. The level of oxygen is expected to decrease so much that no oxygen-using organism is going to be around on the planet in the next 1 to 2 billion years. The sun is currently swelling at a rate that in about 2 to 3 billion years, it will be so big the Earth's orbit will be inside the sun. We will be plasmalized. The planet will be plasmalized by the sun into something hotter than gas. So there are changes coming. Hopefully there are branches that can adapt and fit into those changed environments, and life will continue. Otherwise, we got to find a new planet. Got to get off this rock. I have a AP Classroom problem set on the AP Classroom website, so you can go to that. If you have anything else you need to finish, please make sure you finish it. We will talk about chapter 26 next class, just some major highlights, and then next week we will review and have a test. Goodbye.